A Nolan Wells bombshell report tonight. Does it reveal new witnesses? And because of the new timeline report, is there a timeline shift in what happened the afternoon and evening? Nolan Wells seemingly disappears. His body found washed up at Horn Island. Good evening. I'm Nancy Grace. This is Crime Stories. I want to thank you for being with us.
The latest interview involving Nolan Wells' closest friend has put one question back at the center of the case. What exactly happened on Horn Island before Nolan disappeared? For weeks, people have been comparing different accounts of that July 4th trip, especially the statements from the friends who were there and the people who knew Nolan best. Now Javon Williams, described in the source material as Nolan's best friend and another black friend who was also on the island that day, has offered his own account of what he saw and where he was when everything began to go wrong. And his account matters because Javon was supposed to be on the same boat as Nolan. According to the interview material, that did not happen because the boat filled up, so Javon traveled separately. But he still made it to Horn Island, and he says he saw Nolan there. That detail becomes important because the timeline surrounding Nolan's final hours has never been simple. The group had traveled by boat to Horn Island, an island roughly 10 miles from the Mississippi mainland, to spend the 4th of July. There were several boats involved, and the young people were spending time around the shore and in the water. At some point, an altercation was reportedly taking place shortly before Nolan went missing at around 4 p.m. That is where the questions begin. Why did Nolan remain behind? Why did the boat leave without him? And what exactly happened during the altercation that witnesses have described in different ways? Javon says he last saw Nolan at approximately 4 p.m. He also said Nolan was with a girl while they were around their friends. The source material says other accounts likewise placed Nolan with a girl around that time. For Javon, however, there was something much more personal about that final meeting. He recalled that when they got to the island, Nolan told him that he loved him. It is a small detail, but in a story now filled with conflicting timelines, it is one of the few moments that gives us a glimpse of the friendship between the two young men before Nolan disappeared. Javon has also explained why he was not on Nolan's boat. He was supposed to travel with Nolan, but because that boat was already full, he took another one. Later, he said he left his phone on the same boat where Nolan's phone was, although he eventually retrieved his own phone before leaving. That phone issue has become one of the recurring questions in the case. Nolan's phone was reportedly left behind on the boat when the group departed. That fact has been discussed alongside questions about what happened to Nolan afterward and whether the various accounts of his movements can actually fit together. And then there is Katie. According to the material, several people said Nolan decided to remain on the island with Katie, while the others dealt with problems involving their boat. But another account attributed to Katie suggested that she believed Nolan had eventually gone back with his friends. Those two versions are difficult to reconcile. Nancy Grace's coverage of the case highlighted the same problem. The boat Nolan had reportedly traveled on was the Triton, and according to the occupants, they left without him after saying they had asked him to get back aboard. Their explanation was that the boat was taking on water and they needed to leave. Nolan's phone, however, remained on the boat. Katie's account, as presented in that same material, was different. She reportedly said Nolan spoke with her briefly, after which his friends called him. She then assumed he had gone back with them. But there were multiple boats at the island. That creates another possible source of confusion in the timeline. If Nolan was talking about going back to another group of friends, was he referring to the Triton specifically, or could he have meant another boat? The source material itself describes this as one of the biggest areas of confusion. And Javon's interview adds another layer. Online, a video had circulated showing what appeared to be an altercation. Some people began wondering whether the young man in that video was Nolan. The audio also led to speculation that someone could be heard demanding his phone back. But Javon did not confirm that the person in the video was Nolan. Instead, he explained that he believed the video involved another friend who had gotten into a dispute. He said the voices sounded too clear for the recording to have captured Nolan from that distance, and he recognized the other friend's voice. He also described that friend as becoming extremely hostile and said people on the boat were trying to calm him down and get him back to land. That distinction is important, because the video may look compelling to people watching it online, but appearance and sound alone do not establish who was involved. Javon has also pushed back against the idea that Nolan's death should automatically be understood through the lens of race. In the material, he says he does not believe the case was about Nolan being black, and instead points to jealousy as what he personally believes may have been involved. That is his opinion, not an established finding by investigators. And there is another detail that makes Javon's position especially interesting. Despite speaking publicly about Nolan and appearing in interviews, Javon told an interviewer that investigators had not yet spoken with him about what he saw that day. That does not prove anything about what happened. But it does raise an obvious question about the investigation. How many first-hand accounts have actually been collected, and how closely have those accounts been compared? Because the story now contains several separate pieces. Javon says he saw Nolan on the island and last saw him around 4 p.m. Other people describe Nolan being with Katie. The people on Nolan's boat say he chose to remain behind. Katie's account, as presented in the source material, points in another direction. There were multiple boats. There was reportedly an altercation, and Nolan's phone remained behind after the boat left. None of those details by themselves establishes what happened to Nolan. But when they are placed beside one another, they show why the timeline has continued to attract so much attention. And just when it seemed the focus would remain on the people who were physically with Nolan that afternoon, another part of the story began drawing even more scrutiny. The claims surrounding his phone, the conflicting location information, and what Nolan's mother says she found when she finally got access to the device. That is where the next piece of this timeline becomes especially difficult to explain. The phone became one of the most important pieces of Nolan Wells' story, because according to his mother, what she found on the device did not look like the phone of a teenager who had spent an ordinary afternoon with his friends. Christine Wells said Nolan was someone who regularly documented his life. He took pictures, recorded moments, and communicated with people through his phone. So when she eventually recovered the device after Nolan disappeared, she expected it to contain some record of July 4th. Instead, she said, the phone appeared strangely empty. According to Christine's account, Nolan's Snapchat account had no visible content, and she said there were no text conversations with his friends from that day. She believed messages or other information that could have helped explain Nolan's final hours might have been removed. That was her interpretation of what she found. But there is an important distinction here. A missing conversation on a phone does not, by itself, prove that someone deliberately deleted it. And the source material does not establish who, if anyone, accessed Nolan's phone or removed anything. In fact, one of the people who had been with Nolan publicly denied doing so. Warren Hudson, who was on the boat with Nolan, said he never went through Nolan's phone. He said he did not know the passcode and had no reason to access the device. Another friend supported that version, saying that, to their knowledge, nobody had accessed the phone between the time it was left on the boat and when it was eventually placed inside a truck. So now there were two very different perceptions of the same device. Christine was looking at an apparently empty account and missing conversations and wondering whether something had been removed. Warren was saying he never touched it. And that leaves a question that cannot be answered simply by watching interviews. Was the information actually deleted, or was there another explanation for what appeared on the phone? That question became even more significant because the phone was not the only part of the timeline where people were giving different accounts. The altercation on the island had also become a major point of discussion. A video circulating online had been presented by some people as possible footage of Nolan arguing with another young man and demanding his phone back. But that identification was never established simply by the recording. In an interview, Warren addressed the video directly. He said the person yelling in the recording was him. He explained that he had gotten into an altercation and was extremely angry afterward. According to his account, his uncle told him to get back on the boat and would not let him return to the confrontation. Warren said he continued yelling from the boat before eventually leaving the island roughly 30 to 45 minutes after the fight. That account is significant because it gives a different explanation for the video that had fueled so much speculation online. And Warren went further. He described the last time he personally saw Nolan. According to Warren, it happened before the fight. Warren said he and his girlfriend had just come away from a group of people. He was walking toward his own boat, while Nolan was walking in the opposite direction toward Wyatt's boat. The two crossed paths. Warren said he acknowledged Nolan as they passed. Then they went their separate ways. That would mean Warren's last confirmed sighting of Nolan, according to his own account, happened before the altercation rather than during it. That detail matters because the public discussion had increasingly connected the fight, the phone, and Nolan's disappearance as though they were automatically part of one event. But the available accounts do not establish that. What they establish is that there was an altercation involving Warren, that a video of the confrontation circulated online, and that people began debating whether Nolan was the person heard in it. Warren says he was the person yelling. Javon has also said he believed the voice belonged to Warren rather than Nolan, and that removes one of the more dramatic assumptions from the timeline. But it does not answer the larger question of what happened to Nolan after Warren last saw him. For that, the timeline has to move beyond the afternoon. According to Warren's account, he eventually returned home and went to sleep after spending the day on the boat. He said he received a phone call around 9:20 that night, but did not answer it. He did not wake up again until shortly after 11. That was when his brother came into the room and told him people were trying to reach him because they were looking for Nolan. Warren said that when he finally got on the phone, he was told Nolan could not be located. His first reaction was reportedly that Nolan was probably still with the girl he had last been seen with. That response is revealing, but it should not be mistaken for proof that Warren knew where Nolan was. At that point, according to his account, the people around him were beginning to realize the situation was serious. Warren said they were becoming increasingly worried and were preparing to contact the Coast Guard. He also said Nolan's mother had already been contacted. That brings the timeline into the hours after Nolan disappeared, and it creates another important question. If the people on the boat believed Nolan had simply stayed behind with a girl, when did that assumption change? At what point did they realize he was actually missing? And perhaps most importantly, what did each person believe Nolan was doing when they left the island? Those questions matter because there were multiple boats and multiple groups of friends. Javon was on a different boat. Warren was on another. Nolan's phone remained with the boat he had originally traveled on. Katie's account, as presented in the source material, placed Nolan with her briefly before she assumed he had gone back to his friends. And Warren's later account said he last saw Nolan walking toward another boat before the fight. None of these details independently tells us what happened next, but together, they show why the timeline has become so difficult to reconstruct. Then there is one more detail about Nolan himself. According to the reporting included in the source material, Nolan knew how to swim and had taken swimming lessons at a Yimka in Ocean Springs, Mississippi. That fact has led some people to question whether an accidental drowning explanation would fully account for what happened. But knowing how to swim does not establish that drowning was impossible. Conditions in open water, exhaustion, panic, injury, and many other factors can affect a person's ability to survive. So again, the distinction between a fact and an inference matters. Nolan could swim. That is one fact. What happened to him in the water is another question. And while people online were building theories around the phone, the fight, and the different accounts, investigators and officials had a much larger problem to solve. They needed to establish where Nolan had been, who had actually seen him last, and how the different boats fit into the timeline. Because if the story is reconstructed incorrectly at even one point, everything that comes afterward can appear to make sense when it actually does not. And this is where Javon's story becomes even more important. He was not on Nolan's boat. He says he saw Nolan around the time of the disappearance. He says he knew Nolan well enough to describe what he believed his friend would and would not normally do. And during a later interview, he was asked a simple question. If Nolan was really planning to stay behind, would that have been normal for him? His answer was not complicated. He said he had never known Nolan to be someone who would simply stay behind while his friends left, especially without making sure he had his phone. That personal knowledge does not prove that someone harmed Nolan, but it explains why Javon remains unconvinced by the simplest version of the story. And when Javon later spoke publicly about what he remembered seeing on the island, one moment in particular drew attention. The moment he was asked whether he had actually seen Nolan that day, and his answer placed him closer to Nolan's final known movements than many viewers may have realized. That answer would soon become one of the most closely examined parts of the interview. Javon's answer during the interview was simple. Yes, he had seen Nolan on the island. But it was the reaction around that answer that sent the interview in a very different direction. The source material shows the moment being discussed after Javon confirmed that he had seen Nolan. A commentator reviewing the interview focused heavily on what appeared to be a movement from Javon's mother immediately afterward, interpreting it as a possible attempt to caution him. That interpretation has circulated as part of the online discussion, but it is important to separate what viewers can actually see from what they believe the movement meant. A gesture on camera cannot establish what someone was thinking or why they made it. What is established in the interview is that Javon said he saw Nolan that day. And that matters because the question had been asked directly. Javon was Nolan's friend. He had been on Horn Island on July 4th. He had traveled on a different boat because, according to his account, Nolan's boat was already full, and despite not being on the same boat, he said he saw Nolan after arriving on the island. The more important question was what Javon actually saw. The source material does not provide a complete minute-by-minute account from him of Nolan's final movements. What it does provide is his statement that he saw Nolan on the island and that he last saw him around 4 p.m. That places Javon among the people who can potentially help establish the timeline. Yet according to the interview, Javon said investigators had not contacted him. That surprised the interviewer because Javon knew Nolan well, was present on the island that day, and was familiar with several of the people who were with Nolan shortly before he disappeared. Javon's response was strikingly straightforward. He said he had nothing to hide. He described Nolan as his friend and said he wanted justice for him. More importantly, he acknowledged that the story, as he understood it, did not make sense to him. That is a different position from claiming to know exactly what happened. Javon was not presented as saying that he had personally witnessed Nolan being harmed. Instead, he was saying that the explanations he had heard did not fit together. And that distinction is important. Because once a case becomes heavily discussed online, people often begin treating uncertainty itself as evidence. A missing detail becomes a suspicious detail. A nervous expression becomes proof that someone is hiding something. A contradiction becomes proof that someone is lying. But none of those conclusions can be established simply from an interview. What can be established is that there were conflicting accounts. One of the most important conflicts concerned the altercation. The source material says a video circulated online that some viewers believed showed Nolan involved in an argument. But Warren Hudson said the person in that video was actually him. He described being involved in the confrontation and said he was ordered back onto the boat afterward. Javon's account, as presented in the material, also supported the idea that the argument involved Warren rather than Nolan. That matters because it separates the confrontation from one of the biggest assumptions that had developed online. If Warren was the person heard in the recording, then the video cannot simply be used as proof that Nolan was involved in that confrontation. At the same time, the existence of an argument still matters to the timeline. The source material says the altercation happened shortly before Nolan disappeared at around 4 p.m. So the question becomes less about identifying the person in the video and more about what everyone was doing around that period. Who was on which boat? Who was on shore? Who was with Nolan? Who saw him last? And when did the different groups realize that Nolan was no longer where they expected him to be? Those are questions that cannot be answered by one dramatic clip. They require the entire timeline. There is another detail that has received attention because it comes from someone who knew Nolan closely. Trace Carter reportedly warned Nolan before the trip. According to the Sun-Herald material included in the source, Carter told him to be careful and to watch out for himself. Nolan reportedly responded that he understood and would contact him later. On its own, that exchange does not indicate that Carter knew something bad was going to happen. Friends tell one another to be careful all the time, especially before a boat trip or a night out. But after Nolan disappeared, ordinary words naturally took on a different meaning. The same thing happened with another fact reported about Nolan. He knew how to swim and had taken swimming lessons at a Yimka in Ocean Springs. Some people used that information to question whether drowning could explain his death. But again, swimming ability does not establish what happened in open water. It does not tell us the conditions Nolan faced, whether he was injured, whether he was exhausted, or whether something else happened before he entered the water. The fact simply tells us that Nolan had swimming experience. And this is where the case becomes particularly difficult. There are facts, there are recollections, there are interpretations, and then there is a growing layer of online speculation sitting on top of all three. One example in the source material goes much further than the available evidence. A social media commentator claimed that the island area was connected to a secret organization and even suggested that Nolan may have been deliberately targeted. Those claims were presented as theories rather than established facts, and there is no evidence in the supplied material establishing such a conspiracy. Other online commentary made even more specific accusations about Javon, Warren, and their families. Those claims also remain speculation. They are important only because they show how far the public conversation had moved away from the original question. What happened to Nolan? The answer was becoming buried beneath increasingly elaborate theories about what everyone supposedly knew. And Javon's interview brought that problem into focus. His actual position was much simpler. He knew Nolan. He was there. He saw him. He was not on Nolan's boat. He had his own phone on the same boat where Nolan's phone remained. And he believed the version of events being discussed publicly did not fully make sense. That last point is perhaps the most important, because Javon was not the only person questioning the timeline. Nolan's mother and other family representatives had also raised questions about what happened after the boats left the island. They wanted the available accounts examined against the physical evidence and the timeline rather than accepted simply because someone repeated them publicly. And the phone remained part of that discussion. Javon's own phone had eventually been retrieved from the boat. Nolan's remained behind. That creates a strange contrast. One friend accidentally left his phone with Nolan's, retrieved it later, and went home. Nolan's phone stayed behind, while Nolan himself did not return. It is a detail that can sound suspicious when removed from context. But it could also have an ordinary explanation. The crucial issue is whether investigators found anything on that device, or in other digital records, that could establish what happened during those missing hours. The source material repeatedly emphasizes that interviews alone are not enough. Statements have to be compared with records, timelines, and other evidence. And that is why the question about Javon being contacted by investigators matters. If someone was present on the island, knew Nolan personally, and says he saw him around the time he disappeared, his account could potentially help fill one of the gaps. But according to Javon's own statement, that interview had not happened. At least publicly, that left another piece of the timeline unresolved. And then came the question that had been hanging over the entire story from the beginning. If Nolan's friends believed he had simply chosen to stay behind, why was his phone still with them? Javon himself said he had never known Nolan to be someone who would casually separate from his friends and leave his phone behind. That does not prove foul play, but it does explain why his closest friend was unwilling to accept the simplest explanation without more answers. And as the public continued comparing the interviews, one thing became increasingly difficult to ignore. The problem was no longer just what one person remembered. It was whether all of these memories could possibly fit into the same timeline. Because if Nolan was seen around 4 p.m. and his friends left without him, The next question is unavoidable. What happened in the minutes after that final sighting? That is where the search, the discovery of Nolan's body, and the family's account of the location begin to change the story again. By the morning after Nolan Wells disappeared, the search had become a very different kind of operation. The people who had spent the previous night hoping Nolan would simply turn up were now looking for him on the water. According to Warren's account, he woke at about 7 that Sunday morning, July 5th, and learned that the group had decided to go out by boat and search for Nolan. Wyatt still had his boat in the water, and they used it to begin looking. They searched the area for several hours. Warren said they were on the water from roughly 9:45 in the morning until around lunchtime. During that search, they spoke with a rescue worker who told them to get off the water because professionals were handling the search. So they returned. But the search did not stop. They began using social media to spread Nolan's information and tried to reach anyone who might have spoken with him or heard from him. At that point, the family was still waiting for answers, and one detail would later become a major source of discussion. According to an account included in the source material, Nolan's parents went to the exact location where his body would eventually be found, but they did not find him there. The account says Nolan's father did not have access to a boat that night. Then, around 5 the following morning, one of Nolan's coaches called and offered to take the family out on a boat to search. That means the location where Nolan was eventually recovered became another point that people began examining closely. If the family had already searched that area, how did Nolan's body later appear there? There may be ordinary explanations. Bodies in open water can move. Water conditions change. Visibility can be poor. A search conducted at one moment does not guarantee that something will be visible at another. But the source material does not provide enough information to determine exactly why Nolan was not found during that earlier search. And that is precisely why the question continued to circulate. The official investigation, meanwhile, was moving towards something that could potentially answer far more important questions than any interview could. The autopsy. The state's autopsy had been completed, but its findings had not been made public. According to the material, the report remained sealed and was expected to be presented as evidence to a grand jury before any public release. That matters because the autopsy could potentially establish something the interviews cannot. How did Nolan die? Was there evidence of injury? Could investigators determine whether he drowned? Was there evidence that someone else was involved? Or was the condition of the remains simply too advanced to provide a definitive answer? The family's independent autopsy had already failed to settle those questions. According to the source material, the forensic pathologist who examined Nolan's remains could not reach a definitive conclusion about either the cause or manner of death. Decomposition had significantly limited the examination. The independent findings could not rule out foul play, but they also did not provide enough evidence to classify the death as a homicide. That is an important distinction. Saying that foul play could not be ruled out is not the same as saying foul play occurred. And saying that an examination could not establish homicide is not the same as saying homicide did not occur. It simply means the available examination did not answer the question. That left the state's autopsy potentially crucial. While people waited for that report, another controversy was growing around an audio recording connected to the case. The recording had been enhanced by audio engineer Jeanette Brantley, who said she stood behind her analysis. She reportedly said investigators had not contacted her directly to review or discuss her work. But the attorney representing one of Nolan's friends took a very different position. Attorney Russell Latino argued that the enhanced recording and the accompanying transcript should not be treated as credible evidence. He criticized the online speculation surrounding the recording and argued that people were reaching conclusions without knowing whether the material had been properly authenticated. And then there was Nancy Grace. She publicly took the opposite view, saying she believed the recording was authentic and had not been fabricated, altered, or manipulated. So 3 positions emerged. The audio engineer defended her work. Nancy Grace believed the recording was genuine. The defense attorney argued that the enhanced material was unreliable, and according to the source material, Investigators had not publicly confirmed whether the voices heard in the recording were authentic or whether the interpretation of those voices was accurate. That last point is critical, because once an audio recording is enhanced, there is a difference between making an existing sound easier to hear and proving what the sound actually means. An enhanced recording can help a listener identify words that were difficult to hear. But identifying a word does not automatically establish who said it, when it was said, or what was happening at that moment. That is why authentication matters. And it is also why the audio controversy should not be treated as settled simply because one person believes the recording is genuine. There was, however, a phrase within the recording that attracted enormous attention. An audio engineer described hearing what sounded like a name followed by a statement indicating that Nolan was dead. She explained that the unfamiliar name stood out to her and caused her to isolate and amplify that portion of the recording. That interpretation became one of the reasons the recording spread so quickly. But the people connected to Nolan's friends disputed the credibility of the enhanced audio. And without an official finding establishing what the recording contains, the safest conclusion is still the simplest one. It is disputed evidence, not a confirmed confession, not proof of murder, not proof that a particular person caused Nolan's death. Disputed evidence. At the same time, the public discussion was becoming increasingly personal. Death threats were reportedly being directed at people connected to the investigation. The material describes threats that included warnings about bloodshed and messages telling people not to go outside. That changed the atmosphere around the case. People who had been willing to speak publicly now had another concern, whether speaking about Nolan could put them or their families at risk. Yet the central questions remained. What happened to Nolan after his friends left? Why did his phone remain behind? Which boat was he actually expected to use to return to the mainland? Who saw him last? What happened between that final sighting and the moment he disappeared? And what would the official autopsy ultimately say? There was also a broader problem. The people involved had not all described the day in exactly the same way. Even Warren's own account shows how easily assumptions could form. When he was first told that Nolan could not be found, he said his immediate thought was that Nolan was probably still somewhere with Katie. At that stage, he did not initially believe there was an emergency. Only later, when the group realized they could not reach Nolan and began contacting the Coast Guard, did the seriousness of the situation become clear. That sequence is important because it shows that not everyone understood Nolan to be missing at the same moment. One person could believe he was with Katie. Another could believe he had returned with friends. Another could be searching the island. And Nolan's phone could still be sitting on a boat. Those details can coexist, but only if the timeline is reconstructed carefully. And this is where the story returns to Javon. He had said he was Nolan's best friend. He had described knowing Nolan since 9th grade, and said Nolan was one of the first people he became close to after moving to Ocean Springs. He recalled Nolan calling him on July 4th to ask where he was parked. He described years of friendship and countless conversations between them. So when Javon says that the story does not add up, it carries a different weight than a random internet theory. He knew Nolan. He was on the island. He saw him, and he was still asking questions. But one thing remained unresolved: whether the information Javon was providing had ever been formally collected by investigators. According to his own interview, it had not. And now, with the state's autopsy complete, and the case reportedly heading toward a grand jury, the next phase would depend less on social media theories and more on evidence that could withstand scrutiny. Because sooner or later, the public would have to separate what people believe happened to Nolan from what investigators can actually prove. And the biggest question of all was waiting inside that sealed autopsy report. By this point, the story surrounding Nolan Wells had become larger than the afternoon on Horn Island. It had become a story about competing memories, unanswered questions, an audio recording that people could not agree on, and a best friend who said something very simple during his interview. None of it added up. That statement from Javon Williams is worth returning to because it is actually more measured than many of the theories that developed around him. When asked whether investigators had spoken with him about what he saw that day, Javon said no. He explained that the people he had spoken with publicly were present around the time Nolan's body was discovered, but that investigators themselves had not yet interviewed him. The interviewer found that surprising. After all, Javon had known Nolan well. He had been on Horn Island on July 4th. He had traveled on a different boat, but he had seen Nolan there, and he said he last saw him around 4 p.m. Javon did not respond by accusing someone of killing Nolan. Instead, he said he wanted justice for his friend, and he repeated that the entire situation was difficult for him because the different stories did not make sense together. That is where the documentary has to draw a line between what is known and what people have claimed. There are people online who have gone much further than Javon himself. One commentator described what they called a spiritual channeling involving Javon and Warren and claimed that Nolan had been killed somewhere other than the island. The same commentator went on to claim that Javon knew who killed Nolan and that other people were involved in a cover-up. Those statements are not evidence. They are allegations and personal interpretations. The source material provides no independent evidence establishing that Nolan was killed inside an apartment, that Javon witnessed a killing, or that he participated in a cover-up. The same commentator later made additional claims about a supposed phone call involving Javon and a woman who was described symbolically as someone with medical knowledge. The commentator insisted that the call had actually occurred, but the supplied material does not provide independent records establishing what that call was about or that it involved Nolan being harmed. Those claims should therefore remain in the category of speculation. And that distinction becomes even more important when looking at the reaction to Javon's interview. A separate commentator focused heavily on Javon's mother appearing to move or touch him immediately after he said he had seen Nolan on the island. The commentator interpreted the gesture as a warning to remain quiet, but a gesture on camera does not tell us what another person was thinking. The only confirmed fact from that exchange is that Javon was asked whether he had seen Nolan, and he answered yes. Everything beyond that is interpretation. The same caution applies to the accusation that people lied about the altercation. The source material contains competing interpretations of the recording. One account says the person heard in the video was involved in the fight and was being restrained by others. Another person believed the voice belonged to Nolan. The available material does not establish that Nolan was the person in the recording. So the recording may be important, but it cannot responsibly be treated as a confession or proof of homicide unless investigators authenticate it and establish what it actually shows. The same principle applies to Nolan's phone. Javon said he had accidentally left his own phone on the boat with Nolan's phone and later retrieved it. Nolan's phone remained behind. That is an unusual detail, but unusual does not automatically mean criminal. Nolan's friend also said he had never known Nolan to be someone who would willingly stay behind while everyone else returned. He said Nolan normally went back with the people he arrived with. That is an important observation from someone who knew him. But it is still a friend's recollection, not physical evidence. Then there is the question of the search itself. According to the source material, Nolan's body was eventually brought back to the dock, where Javon and other friends gathered. It was there that Javon publicly reacted to the news. The sheriff's office said the case would be handled like any other investigation, and that authorities would be thorough. Jackson County Sheriff John Ledbetter specifically asked the family and Nolan's close friends to be given space and time while they processed the tragedy. That statement is important because, despite everything being said online, the investigation was not being conducted through social media. The official question remained the same: what happened to Nolan? And the supplied material does not give us a definitive answer. It does not establish that Nolan was murdered. It does not establish that he drowned accidentally. It does not establish that Javon knew who killed him. It does not establish that Warren or any other friend caused Nolan's death. It does not establish that the disputed audio recording proves homicide. And it does not establish that the gestures seen during interviews were evidence of a conspiracy. What it does establish is that Nolan was on Horn Island on July 4th. Javon says he saw him there. Javon says he last saw him around 4 p.m. An altercation occurred around that period. Nolan's friends eventually left the island without him. His phone remained behind. A search followed, and Nolan was later found dead. Those are the pieces that can be discussed without speculation. Everything beyond them requires evidence. That is also why Javon's newest interview is significant, not because it suddenly solved the case, but because it brought attention back to one of the people who was actually there. He was not on Nolan's boat. He did not claim to have witnessed Nolan's death. He did not publicly identify a killer. What he did say was that he knew Nolan well, that he saw him that afternoon, and that the explanations surrounding his friend's final hours did not make sense to him. For a family still looking for answers, that may be more important than any viral theory. Because theories can spread in minutes, evidence takes longer, and the difference between the two can determine whether a grieving family receives an answer or simply another story to debate. There is also something else worth remembering about Nolan himself. Before the arguments about boats, phones, audio, and interviews, he was simply a young man who went out with friends on a holiday. His friend Trace Carter had reportedly told him before the trip to be careful and watch out for himself. Nolan responded that he understood and would contact him later. He never made that promised call. Javon later paid tribute to him online, remembering the calls, messages, laughter, and time they had shared. That is the part of this story that can easily disappear when every conversation becomes about suspicion. Nolan was not a headline. He was someone's friend, someone's son, someone who expected to come home. And that is why the unanswered timeline still matters. The central question is not simply whether people online believe Javon, Warren, Katie, or anyone else. The real question is whether the available evidence can establish what happened between Nolan's final confirmed sighting and the discovery of his body. Until that question is answered by reliable evidence, the gaps remain gaps. And perhaps that is the most honest conclusion this story can reach. Javon's interview did not solve Nolan Wells' death. It did, however, put one fact firmly back into the conversation. His best friend says he saw Nolan on the island that afternoon, and he remains convinced that the story told afterward does not completely fit. So what do you think is the most important unanswered question in Nolan's timeline? The decision to leave him behind, the phone that remained on the boat, the disputed recording, or something else? Share your thoughts below, but keep in mind that allegations are not the same as proof. And if you want more long-form investigations where we separate the confirmed facts from the claims and unanswered questions, consider subscribing.